Then I think we should. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome to the ACM webinar today on language matters and the use of the term underrepresented minorities. Welcome, welcome. We're going to wait a few minutes as people start to come in. And we will get started shortly. Thanks for coming today. I am Cobb Payton, co-chair the DEI committee on the educational advisory, and my colleague, Susan, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Susan Reeser, and I teach at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and I'm just delighted to be able to work with Faye and welcome Nicki and Tiffani.
All right, we'll let the count keep going. We're up to 108 participants. And so we are going to get started at right about now. I think we've seen a little slowdown. All right, welcome to today's webinar. This is the ACM webinar from the DEI committee of the educational advisory. I am delighted today, again, I am Cobb Payton. I am delighted today to have Nicki Washington and Tiffani L. Williams on the webinar today to talk about language matters, as well as the use of the word underrepresented minorities. And so we're going to have an honest conversation, honest dialogue for the audience. If you have questions, if you could place those in the chat, we will try to get to all of those today. And we will go ahead and get started. Yes, in the chat, please introduce yourselves. That would be really great. We got someone from the Philippines on. And so this is clap, clap for you. So thanks for being here. We got Lisa Smith who's on. We have others that are on, so please introduce yourselves in the chat. All right, so we are going to go ahead with introductions. So Nicki Washington hails from Duke University. Nicki, could you please introduce yourself and tell us how you got into computing? And then we will move to Tiffani L. Williams to introduce us. I just love that L in the middle there, Tiffani. So Nicki, tell us about yourself.
Thanks for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicki Washington. I got into computing at an early age. My mom was a programmer at IBM and a math major in college. So she was part of the group of Black folks who early on were given training at IBM to then become programmers. So I was exposed to computing very early and kind of just kept doing it there, stumbled into majoring in computer science as well as pursuing a PhD in computer science, which kind of leads me here.
All right, thank you. Tiffani, tell us about yourself.
Yes, so I'm Tiffani Williams. I'm at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the computer science department. As far as how I got into computing, my story is similar to Nicki's in that I've been in it since an early age. I actually have always loved video games. So, if I'm going to show my age a little bit, I, love the Atari 2600.
Oh, I know that one. I know that one.
I played ET religiously.
Yes, so all the games. And then in that era, the Commodore 64 came out, and I just had to have it. And so in any case, I've just sort of been doing it ever since. One of the things I think about computer science for me, since I've been doing it, certainly since it was called junior high when I was in school, but since I was in junior high, when it came to apply to college, I guess maybe there's some, we didn't have that terminology then, imposter syndrome. but you know, I had to check a major, and I didn't check computer sciences. I was like, maybe I'll do physical therapy. Now, I had never done anything with physical therapy or whatever. I ended up going to Marquette University, which has a big physical therapy school. Back then, you had to call for them to send you a college application. So I remember calling, and they were like, "Oh, since it's a really great program, it fills up really early." So they're like, "We're not taking any more physical therapy applications." They're like, "Are you interested in something else?" I'm like, oh, "Okay, I'll do computer science." So that's kind of my, even though
Wow.
I should have done computer science anyway, right? I had no, yeah, but in any case, but yes, so that's, I've been doing computer science, yeah, because I said since I was a kid, and it's been a roller coaster, but enough to keep me, you know, on the ride.
All right. Well, thanks for those introductions. So we're going to kick it off with sort of this first question. So one of the things that sort of spawned this conversation as we are part of the educational advisory is around language and how language really does matter. And so the first question will go out to you, Tiffani, is you wrote this blog, this ACM blog on URMs, right? And we've often talked about who gets cited in the space, right? And who's sort of known for the work. And my colleague Susan and I were talking about this, and she said, you know, yes, I think that's a great question. What led you to the blog, to write the blog? And why do you think that it's really not cited as some of the other works have been, particularly in the computing space?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a lot there. So hopefully I can keep it brief, because that could probably take a whole thing in and of itself. What I would say is, in terms of the term itself, underrepresented minority, I was not familiar with this term, certainly when I was an undergraduate, or even really a graduate student. I don't think I really became familiar with the term until I became a faculty member in 2005, around 2005, at Texas A&M University. And that's where I started hearing it more, right? People using it for grant proposals and just DEI related stuff. And I can just remember just feeling, and still today, I never liked the way that word made me feel, right? So a lot of my discomfort with URM is that no matter how it was used, it was always going to be applied to me or Black folk, no matter how it was defined. And it just never felt empowering, or it just never made me feel good. Over the years, I, you know, shared my discontent with using the language. I myself never really used it. But summer of 2020 gave me an opportunity to be a part of various protests as it related to justice for Black people, and empowerment for all. And so, given the timeliness of that particular message, a blog post seemed quite timely versus going through months or, you know, half a year of a review process, which, you know, it may have missed the mark in terms of the timeliness. So that's really why the interest in the blog post was just the timeliness of the message. I think also, looking back at it, after reading it, I didn't want any reviewer comments. This is what I want to say. I want to change it. You know, I don't know. I was just in a mode.
Yeah.
And so I had many people read it, so there's not necessarily that. But wasn't in that frame of mind at that period in time. I'm just not interested in going in a back and forth with some reviewing process about this, when mostly many of the reviewers were not going to be people who were Black women, right, or Black folks. So there's that. And as far as in terms of the citation part, I think just in terms of we talked about the currency in academia, about publications. Our currency model is quite narrow, right? It is basically journals and peer-reviewed conference papers, and that's even somewhat unique in computer science. And so as we talk about these other mediums like blog posts and things like that, that just has not become the norm. So I think in terms of one aspect of citations is just that our citation counts, our H factors and all of that stuff are really all around peer-reviewed work, when a lot of things in terms of timeliness are going to be revolved around various blog posts, especially when it comes to various protests or responding to protests. Those things are just going to be more timely because the process is faster.
Thank you, thank you. So if you have
something to that before you go into the next point.
Yeah, I'm not going to go to the next one.
Oh,
I'm just
sorry.
going to remind the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, because Tiffani definitely dropped a lot of nuggets there. I'm sure that's going to spawn some questions. We have people from all over, from the Philippines to others in North Carolina. So we'll say that. And I saw the Oregon crew, as they call themselves, are on. So Nicki, did you want to add something to that point?
Yeah, I want to emphasize and ask everyone to really pay attention to what Tiffani said, because computer science is a very unique place, as she noted. But when you look at what's happening in a lot of the humanities and social science, they don't operate in that space. So people like the Tressie McMillan Cobbs has an entire essay and blog post that she has via Substack, right? And it's getting tons of followers, subscribers, and that's moved her even into the New York Times opinion columns that she's doing now. There are these opportunities that are created by Black women for themselves in these spaces that are being taken up, because in computing, I think that we as Black women need to start doing more of that. And so as Tiffani said about blogging, I think that that's a perfect rationale. It's also the reason why, even when I wrote my book, I didn't try to go through press or other people, because I already knew nobody's gonna buy into that, right? So you have to do things yourself, but that speaks to the creativity and the need, and just serving that need that Black women have of not waiting for other people to validate our stories and our work. And that's so important for everyone on this call who is not a Black woman to pay attention to, because we are not afforded those luxuries that you all often get, which is the automatic, oh, it's a accept in a peer review across the board. The work we do is so marginalized. The work we want to do is marginalized unless it looks like someone who is not a Black woman. And so we have to create our own space.
Okay, appreciate that point. So we have a question that is in the Q&A, excuse me, questions in the Q&A. Here's a question. Is the underserved the same feeling as underrepresented?
So I'll start, and then Nicki, please feel free to add on. So when I wrote the blog post, I was really responding to the two words of underrepresented and minorities together. And part of it is because that particular phrase, that particular label is used in graphs, it's used in plots, they're used in ways of people to track how they're doing diversity. So it became a category for data. And in that sense, it's a little bit different than the underserved, and they have commonalities. But this big thing with this URM, it had become a category. In fact, one would even probably say it became a race for all of these people put together and clumped together, and people using increases or decreases in that category to say something about diversity, right? Mm-hmm. And again, I said it in a visual way in terms of I didn't like the way that term made me feel, but I would also be around people who would be categorized in this URM category, and no one ever at the table used that term to categorize theirself, right? And so part of the reason that this URM is problematic is, one, people usually don't define it, so it's not precise to define. And the second thing is that the people who are applied, people who are given that label, they don't actually use it themselves. So there's no excellence in underrepresented minority award, right? There's no, there's no T-shirt that says I'm an underrepresented minority, or underrepresented minority power, right? Or legal underrepresented minority computer scientists, right? this was a term that was placed on us, and it was in some sense this hidden racism that the category it just became this default way of referring to people and allowing people who are not comfortable with saying race, like Black, or saying Latina, or saying Latino, and a Native American, a whole category of things, to have a way to sweep that all under the rug, put everyone in the same category, but none of the people who are in that category had any say in the name of that category that has been placed upon them. So in that sense, I just want to make sure it's not just about the use underrepresented, and it's not just the use of minority, it's the use of them together used as a data label. And so in terms of underserved, I have issues with that as well, but it has a different issue than underrepresented minority. I think there are times to use it, but I don't think we should be using it 100% of the time, because it basically is a lack term and it's not a feeling of empowerment. But it has a different issue than the giant one, in my opinion, which is the URM, which is a data label.
Okay. Nicki.
I don't see underserved and underrepresented in the same space, because when I hear underserved, I think of socioeconomic class. And so I would argue that I don't consider, I would not want to be labeled as an underserved population just because I'm Black. But I think that there, like Tiffani said, there are valid times when underserved is the most apropos wording, but labeling people based on racial and ethnic makeup is not the case. And I think that the bigger problem I see with it as well is that when you try to create, like Tiffany's already said, these ideas of lumping things into groups, it's always going to be because people don't want to say something and call it out, right? That's why when people are really talking about Black, but they use people of color, because they're unafraid to say Black people. And I think we have to really pay attention to these kind of things. And also, I remember a lot of times that my mom talked about, even in their space, the way in which language changed to things I see in the chat around inner city youth, how the word urban became something to apply to a specific demographic of people. I feel like that's what Tiffani got at a lot of times with this idea of URM, and I hate it. I've sat in department meetings where white faculty start saying, well, are we thinking about URMs? And I have blurted out, why are y'all still saying URMs? This is problematic. As the Black woman on this call, stop saying that. Because it's so easy to roll off instead of calling out who you actually want to talk about. I don't understand why people are scared to say Black, white, Asian, poor, disabled, queer, etc.
Okay. Okay, so go ahead, Tiffani.
Just one more thing, right? So a lot of times we see this phrase, which I love, is representation matters, right? And part of the thing in terms of representation matters, if we had the representation, this URM wouldn't have even been a thing. So a lot of the language, right, that is problematic is because the folks that it applies to are not at the table. They're not in decision-making positions to be like, yo, let's not use this, right? We don't use the word overrepresented. Majority is overrepresented because they're at the table, right? And it don't feel good to be called that either, right? So part of the thing is just in terms of the representation. And then the second thing I'll just say, as Nicki was saying, is that it's all about, if it makes sense in the context, which most times it does, being more specific than general would be the approach, in my opinion.
Okay. All right. So here's a question from the Q&A, which says, thank you for sharing this and how it impacts you personally. When I push for changes in language like this, I get pushback that we are required to use underrepresented minority by law in an affirmative action and in iPads and in EEO incidences. Have you had any feedback? Do you have any feedback to this? And what is a good replacement term? So we'll start with you, Nicki. What is a good
replacement term?
Yes. What is a good replacement term? So we'll start with you first, Nicki.
I know that there's certain places where that language somehow needs to appear, like federal data proposals, et cetera. I have tended to use groups that are historically underrepresented in computing because it takes away when it has to follow that kind of language. Because I just don't like underrepresented, underrepresented groups in general. It's really tricky. And I know I try to navigate this with NSF and proposals and writing. I've also kind of slid in minoritized a lot of times instead of using that language. Or honestly, I would say groups that are historically underrepresented in computing based on race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, class. So now you're not calling a people a thing. You are specifying that you're talking about a spectrum of people who may fit into this idea of being underrepresented in this space of computing.
Okay. All right. Tiffani, did you have anything to add? And then I'll ask Susan if there's something in the chat perhaps that I have missed. Tiffani?
Yeah, so I think, right, changes happen in waves, right? So it may be difficult to change the university's mechanism of categories that they place people in, but we can change how we write things in the proposal, right? We can change how we write things in department documents, right? We can change how we write things in maybe our local organizations. So I think part of it is just that the parts where we can affect change, that we use that language to show an example and not to perpetuate. So I'm with Nicki in terms of, you know, I think maybe if we can take some things from both the LGBTQ plus community as well as the people with disabilities communities. One of the things that the LGBTQ community does is essentially list, you know, all of the aspects of their community and represent them with a letter, right? And the plus, you know, is this notion that, you know, this is not a complete list, right? So there's one way that one could do that. So for example, if you're not defining URM in the first place and using it, you're doing an injustice. In fact, you're not even being a scientist. It's quite lazy. And so if you actually can define URM and you're really only considering maybe Blacks, Native Americans, and Hispanic or Latino population, if those really are the ones that you're considering, I don't know why we can't list them out, right? Or even list them out and use sort of a nomenclature like the LGBTQ plus community. The other thing that Nicki mentioned can follow more with the people with disabilities. So here talk about groups who are underrepresented by race, by ethnicity, by geography, right? As she said, keeping it clinical and it not being about judging or placing any kind of criticism on a particular community of people.
Okay.
And I think too, go ahead.
I think those two communities can give us an idea of labeling that is more, you know, that doesn't do as much harm as what we currently do.
And I think we need to bring attention to the fact that sometimes what these organizations, government agencies are asking for is problematic as well. For example, if they're asking, and I see the labels all the time on things, we want to attract women and underrepresented minorities, women and underrepresented groups. Well, who are you talking about? Because over here, you're really only talking about white women. And so we need to start, especially if we are sitting in these positions of power in these agencies, we need to be the ones, or the people who are sitting there need to be the ones who are having these conversations, right? Around how do we start to get people to understand that when you call out women separately and underrepresented groups, that trickles down to everyone else in the proposals that they write. And then when I ask people, who exactly are you talking about when you put women over here? What about Black women, Indigenous women, Asian women? We're all sitting over here in this one category because y'all don't understand that we're not considered women by the definition that you're creating. And that's a big part of what even Patricia Hill Collins calls out in a lot of Black feminist thought, is this idea that, you know, how the whole Sojourner Truth, ain't I a woman? You know, the things that I've done, I'm do the same things as a white woman, plus all of these other things. So we have to start collectively changing our language so that then also those sitting in federal agencies and things like that see we need to make a change as well.
Yeah. So I'll reserve comment on the federal agency side, but there are many questions that have come up in Q&A and a lot of discussion in chat. So I want to ask this specifically. Does BIPOC solve the problem? Okay,
No, it does not.
tell the audience, this was a question that came up for several people. Does BIPOC solve the problem? And if it doesn't, tell her why not. And if it does, tell her why it does.
Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It still does not call out who specifically you're talking about. I guess for me, the issue is always, why can't you say exactly who you're talking about? If it's Black, Indigenous, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Asian women, and Latino women, like, why can't we call out racially and ethnically who we are specifically talking about? It takes more characters, yes. It can be different than what we've used before, yes. But people consider the fact that when you're writing, that someone who may be Indigenous or someone who may be Native Hawaiian is reading your text. And how do you think that they're going to process when they see BIPOC or URM? Wouldn't it make them feel a little bit more seen and validated by knowing that you're including them in this space of language that you're talking about? We need to broaden participation in or attract people who identify as insert identities. I just don't understand why that. I don't use BIPOC because I just don't feel like it still does enough. If I'm going to spell out races and ethnicities, I'm going to call out exactly what I'm talking about.
Okay, Tiffani?
Yeah, so I agree with all that. So BIPOC doesn't have the same issues as URM, because BIPOC, at least people who would be in that category got around, and there's been discussion for and against, right? There was never any discussion around URM. So in that sense, it's quite different. But thinking back to why did we ever use underrepresented minority and versus just minority, period? Or why don't we just say people of color? Not to say that any of those are what we want to do, but why was this term underrepresented minority even proposed, right? Mm-hmm. And the issue is that when you're thinking about minority populations, this general Asian population is not underrepresented in computing, and so, or at least in STEM. And so you couldn't say minorities because there's at least a group of minorities who are not underrepresented in computing. So that's sort of where this at least logically where this underrepresented minority part comes in. When you look at BIPOC has the same issue. It still has in there minorities who are not underrepresented in computing. And if you're writing proposals that are trying to solve that population, just saying BIPOC includes populations that are not underrepresented in computing. So if you mean it in that way, if you mean it in terms of saying BIPOC as a way to say underrepresented groups, then BIPOC does not serve that purpose.
Okay. All right. Susan, turning to you. I know we got lots going on. There's a lot going on in the chat. There's several questions in the Q&A, and then I have a next question teed up. But Susan, is it something burning out there? I know there is, but can you give us one?
There's a lot, as you know. How do you define minorities in underdeveloping countries?
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, I'm concerned that question is presented the way it is because people who are in other countries are not necessarily the minority there. And I think that that's a really arrogant assumption. For example, one, what are you considering an underdeveloped country? Mm-hmm. And what is the majority population there is the second question. Because individuals who are coming from a lot of countries internationally are the majority there. They come to the US and then all of a sudden it's a totally different scenario because now they're presented as part of a minoritized group. I have plenty of students who discuss this in class, that they didn't understand the context, the cultural context of being in the US, because where they were coming from. And these are students who are from countries in Africa, countries in Asia, where they are the majority. So we have to be very careful of the arrogance that we have as US citizens. I don't know who posed the question and I don't know their citizenship status, but I think sitting here in the US, there is this assumption that anyone who is not white is a minority everywhere else, and that is not true.
Okay, Tiffani?
I don't have nothing to add.
Okay. Okay, so that tees me up for my question, right? That tees me up for my question. What can every computer science teacher do to, in their classrooms, to address students that may be the onlys in the classroom and how they may feel? And say, for instance, the only Black, the only Native American, the only woman. What should happen in that classroom?
So I'll just say a few things, right? So this question of the only, right? A lot of, and it's probably true, but sometimes, right, when we say the only, we're using it based on our eyes. Right, so we may not have actually had a conversation with this person to really know what their background actually is, right? So we're making a lot of assumptions about what that person's background is, assuming that they're the only. And again, there's just a whole bunch of things going on in terms of people and our backgrounds and things like that. So I think we would just want to be careful with that. But I think the big thing, in fact, I'm going to give a presentation later today about this. I think the big thing to do is to present stories. So one of the things about computing is that, and I wrote about this recently in the communications of ACM, is that a lot of the way in which we teach computing, we abstract the human out of it. So it's all about the algorithms. It's all about the running time. And it's all about, oh, AI did this and machine learning did that. And we should blame the AI algorithm. No, we should blame the human being. The human being is the one who is over all of this stuff. But you wouldn't know it in our computer science curriculum because a lot of it is about the actual algorithm itself and not about us and how we are actually the inventors of these things. So when we're talking about the only one or one of the few, I think the bigger thing is how do we get humanity back into computing, right? And so I think if you can show the human aspect of computing, I don't care who you are, you can find some avenue into that story that hopefully you can identify.
Okay, Nicki, did you want to add something there?
To make sure I understand the question in full, what if a student is one of the only racial or ethnic identities?
Yeah.
How do you make them feel welcome?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think it's, I have to stress this because I know a lot of times I've seen over the last 2 years, especially how some people have said, oh, we should ask students, to speak for, please don't. I would say the best thing you can do
to speak for
their race or ethnicity.
Race or group of people.
Oh, you're Black, so what do you think? Right. What I have always tried to do in my classes is create a space where students are able to bring their most authentic and whole selves to the table. And what you find is when you allow students to have a brave space, they will step up and share things about them that they would not normally share in a computer science classroom, unsolicited. So if there's a topic that you are discussing that is relative to them, then it's not necessary for me to say, oh, Tina, you're Latina, what do you think, right? If I'm just talking about something that is impacting that community at the time, someone who has a strong feeling about it will usually speak up and say, well, I am insert identity, and here's my thoughts. And I think we have to make sure that we're creating those environments that students are able to do that. That means that you can't necessarily always have a conversation around zeros and ones. You have to bring in, like Tiffany's talked about, the human side. You have to be able to weave in what's happening in the world around them in the classroom every single day, right? It may not seem like it's making sense in the context of the lesson for the day, but who cares? Because sometimes students need to see that. You know, I remember when, for example, the shootings in Atlanta were happening, and I remember talking about holding space in my class. I stopped and said, I want to hold space just for everyone in the Asian community for what's going on today. And then as we started to do that, students would start to speak up as we moved on in the discussion later. I didn't have to ask anyone, but it was just, I want us to recognize that how this, just like what we saw with, for example, January 6th, just like what we saw with Ahmaud Arbery, it's all rooted in white supremacy. Now, everybody who is not white feels comfortable speaking up and talking about how they have been impacted. But I didn't have to ask anyone to do that or single anyone out.
So the world's not binary, huh? It's not zeros and
No,
ones,
who
right?
knew?
Okay,
Huh?
who knew, right?
Go figure.
So here's a question in the Q&A though. This person says, my worry about specificity is that if I leave a group out, what if I miss something? What if I miss a group? If I'm getting that specific on, you know, Black and female, Latina and Asian, and if I'm getting down to that level, right? If I'm disaggregating the data, can you suggest a strategy on how to avoid this? This person is concerned about leaving someone out.
So can I
If I make a list, if they make a list.
So I'll just say, let's be clear, when we put everyone in a group that's generic, we're leaving folks out too, right? It's just that, you know, we don't, it's like, oh, when we say broadening participation for computing for all, okay, that technically doesn't leave everybody out, but am I included in the all? So the point is, no matter which way you go, whether you're like, I just want to say underrepresented minority, which no one's going to say here, or I say, you know, start listing groups, in both cases, you have issues of leaving out or invisibility, right? So the point then is that what is it that you're trying to accomplish? So if in the end you're working on some project or you're working on your recruiting for your CS department or your courses, and you want to increase the number of women, let's say, even women leaves people out because just as Nicki said, are we really looking at Black women? Are we really looking at Indigenous women, right? So again, you have to really look at what is it that you're trying to do with this labeling. And I would say, again, list out the things, list out the groups, but I think we can still borrow from the LGBTQ community, if you're worried about it, to put a plus and define a plus. I'm not saying that that's exactly what you need to do, but to be worried that you're going to leave someone out, you can maybe even make a footnote. This is the groups I know I may be leaving someone out, but these are the groups that are most of interest or most a priority in terms of whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. But this notion that if I say all, or this notion that I say underrepresented groups or things like that, you're still leaving folks out. In fact, they're become even more invisible.
Okay. Nicki, I don't, do you have, okay. So I want to take a question from the chat, and then Susan, I'm going to throw it to you to catch something. I know there's plenty of hot burning issues going there because I can see the messages coming through. So let's shift just a second. This is a very interesting comment that was posted in the chat, and this person says, I think of, for example, the Asian ethnic groups. In the US, in CS, all Asian ethnicities are lumped together. They're aggregated. But there are Asian minority groups, many times refugees, whose experiences are also erased, but they're lumped in as Asian. This is a very US-centric and heavy historical context discussion and you know, sort of language that we're talking about. How would you respond to that in terms of translation and consideration for the historical context and the points that this attendee is making?
So this gets back from my perspective to the point of not necessarily calling out these things and just saying people who are underrepresented by race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, ability, class, etc. And also to Tiffany's point, I think that we often, and self-included, have often not accounted for the fact of what Asian population is actually overrepresented and what population is underrepresented. That comes out a lot of times, even in discussions in class. For example, students who are Filipino, for example, may discuss how they don't have that same representation as someone who may be Indian. And so that's definitely, I think, a point where not giving names sometimes helps to be more inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And not giving acronyms helps to be more inclusive as well.
Okay. Susan?
So one of the questions is asking about resources. It would be helpful to read up on and to develop cultural intelligence. And we know about Tiffany's blog, but Nicki, could you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yeah, so I don't know if it would be helpful in the context of language though, but Unapologetically Dope was kind of the book that I wrote as a love letter to Black women and girls. It was a book that at the time, there were a lot of questions that were coming from a group of Black women at Black Compute Her around navigating spaces that, as I sat there with a couple of other Black women who are about the same age professionally and as well, and we were surprised and floored that these things were still kind of happening. And so it became a way for me to say, okay, I always had my mom to lean on, but everyone's not going to be sitting in BCH. Everyone is not going to have the same social networks. And so how can they have a guide to know that, one, you're not the only person who's gone through this, and two, here's what I did and the lessons learned, not that they were always the right thing to do, but here are the lessons learned for how to navigate this space such that you don't end up feeling like you're just existing. And I think that's what happens a lot of times for those of us in minoritized groups. We feel like we're just trying to get through it instead of being able to enjoy the ride, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so we have another question from the chat. This person says, how can we white folks working in DEI in our organizations leverage the expertise of Black, Indigenous, Latinx colleagues without contributing to the disproportionate service burden placed on these colleagues, the invisible work? Tiffani?
So, I think I know a little bit about the question in terms of what they're asking, but then there's the other part. So if what I'm going to say is not what the person intended, I think it's still a good message for me to say anyway. So hopefully there's not this notion that we're going to learn from that people in those populations are going to educate white folks about this stuff, right? That's not necessary. That would be an unfair burden, and it's not a burden that anyone in this space needs to take on in terms of educating. So I don't know if that's what the question is asking, but that was sort of my first reaction to it. I think the second thing is to have some patience and to find ways to uncenter yourself from the conversation. So that is in terms of uncentering. It ain't about you, right? I mean, part of the harm is that white folks have put themselves in the middle of the conversation for a number of different reasons: white guilt, white savior, all that stuff. Get out the picture. So that's one. And then the patience is that if you're really about what you say you are, your actions will speak. But it's going to take some time because you coming in with a whole bunch of baggage, and Black women's census or minoritized population census is very acute. And so, and we've all been harmed, we've all been broken, we've all been disappointed. So just you saying that you want to help, I'm going to need a bit more than that. Right. So I'm gonna sit and wait and buy my time and so on and so forth. And if you're about your business, maybe there will be some partnership or maybe, but the white person does not need the Black woman or the Black man or the indigenous community to do their work. Because there's a lot of work that white folks need to do that I ain't got nothing to do with.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, couple of things. One, plus one to what Tiffani said around decentering yourself. I think that, there's a lot of work, and I've already blogged about this, but there's the ACM 60 climate survey that we did before in 2019, early 2020. It actually highlighted from the responses of the community that one of the major themes in that community is the dominance of white folks as DEI experts, and particularly self-proclaimed DEI experts who are problematic. If you believe that you are in the space of DEI as a white person, and that you are on the right side of history, you should not be telling people that. Other people should be telling you that, specifically people who don't hold your identity. If you have been the person touting yourself, or others who are like you have been touting yourself, I think that speaks volumes to whether you're really an expert. Because those, like we say outside of, the real ones know. And we know who those real ones are. And it doesn't need to be stated. But what I would say is, one, seed space to anyone else who is not white. You should not be centering their voices. Again, a lot of the work around communities like Black and Indigenous, especially, there's research that talks about that the people who have expertise are not the people who always have the academic credentials. They're the people with the lived experience, and that idea of standpoint theory and the importance of that. If you don't have that standpoint, you are not an expert. And that cultural identity piece is important in contributing to your knowledge. It's just as much about unlearning as it is about learning. So I would ask, what are you unlearning? Because a lot of people who are working in the space of DEI need to unlearn. I have talked about the fact that I've had to unlearn things as a Black woman because I was trained and educated in spaces that were oozing of white supremacy at times. And so you can't, by design, be that person who thinks you know what's happening. I'd also say you should actually be looking to the people in anthropology, in sociology, in history, in psychology, particularly the Black and brown folks who are doing the work over there, who are the experts, because they have been talking about this for decades and centuries now. You can go back to Du Bois. You can go back to, again, Sojourner Truth and all of these Black women who were abolitionists and suffragists, and read what they were writing about white women at the time specifically and see it's the same thing. But I also want to make sure that we don't limit this to just race, because I think that when we talk about problematic in DEI, we also need to think about all of the other identities as well.
Absolutely.
And so we all exist in some point in a position of privilege, usually, and we need to make sure that we are inclusive in our language and our understanding, just as much about ability, about class, about gender, sexuality, etc.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That's a clear understanding of what intersectionality means, right? And a lot of people think that from a DEI lens, intersectionality is about a box that you can check. It's not about the boxes. It is about that situational power that exists within structures. And, as Andrea Lori said, we all are multi-identity in some ways, right? Okay, so here's one additional question. And then Susan, I'm gonna throw it to you, but one question came up. ACM is really trying to work very hard on these matters, particularly on language matters and words matter. And hopefully, I think you've seen the ACM Words Matters listing. Any thoughts to, sort of the alternative terminology that can be used in the computing profession? Average user, Black, white box, blind, double blind, blind review, master slave, quantum superiority. What are your thoughts about this effort to sort of reimagine and re-implement the kinds of language that we use, and even for our teaching and learning? And Jan put this link also in the chat for the audience so that they can know what we're referring to. When you saw that list, what you think, Tiffani?
Yeah, so I mean, I love the list. The thing I liked about it was it wasn't just a don't use this, use that. There was a sentence or so about what was the issue, a bit of education there. But I do want to do one, and so I'm all in support of that. So I'm about to put a comma.
Yeah, go ahead. But
the thing that I think as a community we have to accept is that language evolves. And so what may be appropriate today, as we learn more and we engage more and we are more in tune, language is going to have to change, right? So we might be taking some problematic language, changing it to something that is acceptable today, which may need to actually evolve to something else because we've learned more that actually that's no longer acceptable. So this expectation we should have with these lists is that it's a representation of where we are today and what is acceptable today, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be acceptable forever, right? So I think that's one. And then second thing I think we have to do with these lists is they are a good starting point. Each of us has to take upon ourselves to not have to solely rely on lists to know if we are using harmful language. If we're going to wait on a list, or our only notion is waiting on a list to telling us what we should or shouldn't use, we're missing the message.
Okay. All right. Nicki, would you like to add to that?
I think the list is great. I think it's a start, but I think it's not enough.
Okay.
Lists are just, and for all the reasons that Tiffani said, plus the fact that lists are just kind of sitting over here as suggestions.
Yes.
But we need things that are going to hold people accountable. Yeah. And a list just, it's a start, but it's not doing enough. And I think that we as a community have to recognize the fact that definitions don't necessarily change a lot of things, but once we start to pair those definitions with accountability steps, then we can start to say, okay, so I am all for the definitions changing, but I would like to also see in alignment with that ACM doing more to expect and hold people's feet to fires, and not just in terms of what you're teaching, but I want to see it in the awards that are given. Yes. I want to see it in the people who are given those awards. We already know what happened a couple of years ago with the problematic touring award, but beyond just asking now to understand what people have done or making sure that people are not problematic when they're nominated for an award, I want to know specifically, what are you doing to advance computing for everybody? That should be from the Turing Award down to the Athena Award and everything else in between. People are we need to be holding people accountable, because otherwise everybody still gets to check a box and say, well, I did just enough. I changed the language over here. And so that's it. I'm good.
Exactly. So what we're hearing is accountability, but also I think the other thing is transparency, as well as, data driven. How are we measuring the change, right? Because we started out this conversation before we went live, and when Susan said what her computer science class looked like at Duke, and Tiffani said, oh, was that yesterday? Yeah. All right, Susan, you take us to the last question. We have about 5 minutes left.
Well, I've got a hard question for you. Can you discuss the reluctance, and I need to attribute Christy Crawford for this, can you discuss the reluctance to talk about race in general, and thus the use of weak general phrases?
I can say it's from two sides. So, and I don't want to seem like a both sides person, so that's not what I'm saying. I see it from the people who are not impacted by race. So white people who tend to be uncomfortable talking about it. And so then it's always this stammering over what they're saying. But then on the other side, I also see those who are minoritized, who don't necessarily feel comfortable saying it because white folks have made it such that if you talk about this, then, oh my God, you're racist because you're always talking about race. And I think that we need to give space primarily for those who identify as, and I'll include Asian in this, Asian, Black, Indigenous as well, and then ethnically Latino, sorry, or Hispanic. You need to give people that space to actually discuss things exactly how they would, again, if they were at home, if they were in their local communities, because we're always talking about race. We don't have the luxury to be uncomfortable talking about it because we are made uncomfortable because of our race and ethnicity. And so for me, I don't know how to tell. That point to me is really a white person issue, and that they need to become more comfortable being uncomfortable. And there are a number of ways that they can start to do that. Like I said, reading, activities. Shameless plug, we do 3C Fellows exactly for this reason, because we need more white people, especially in computing, since it's still dominated by white faculty, to get comfortable being uncomfortable, so that then they can understand the ways in which they're impacting not only their students, but also their colleagues.
All right, Tiffani, last word.
Everything that Nicki said, I think the thing that, and I'll just, since Nicki mentioned about white folks have to get comfortable with calling groups what they want to be called. So their uncomfortableness to say Black is a function of you, not a function of the community. But your comfortableness of saying clumping groups together is a function of your comfort that then you're allowing to harm other groups. So being comfortable with, again, decentering yourself from the conversation and being like, this is what this community wants to be called, and that is the appropriate way to refer to the group within the larger context of an organization, and so forth.
Can I say one last thing? Because I cannot let it go in the chat.
Okay.
I see someone made a comment around labeling people as racist on both sides is harmful. Let me be very clear. If someone is being racist, then it needs to be called out. I am not a very fine people on both sides kind of thing. And I don't subscribe to this idea that people who are racist should not be called out as racist because it does not produce thoughtful conversation. You're not going to have thoughtful conversation with somebody who's a racist anyway. I'm looking at all of these white supremacists we see, and I think that that gives coverage for people to continue to be problematic by saying that, oh, it's an issue with both sides. First of all, there's plenty of, again, this is why we need to study anthropology, history, sociology, et cetera, and understand what racism is as it's defined. I would suggest that that person and everyone else go read Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. It gives a great definition of racism, which defines that no one else who is not white can be considered racist, because there is a privilege and advantage that happens that is a result of white supremacy. So thank you. I'm sorry.
All right. So with that, we are going to bring this to a close. We want to thank all of those that were on the webinar today. We had over 120 on the call at one point. Want to thank you for calling in, for listening, for the chat. We didn't get to everything, and hopefully you will log on to the next one when that will be. So thank you to Nicki Washington and Tiffani L. Williams, and Susan and I are calling this a wrap. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. So I think Jan put a link in the